So here we are on Lac Souvière fishing in the outflow swim. This swim has a set of lily pads about 40 yards out. It's a very good feature. The fish like these lily pads a lot. Underneath these lily pads there's a really extensive set of roots and stems and so on, and we see very often fish lost in these lily pads. In particular this swim, also fishing from the middle swim to these pads from the opposite side, and in particular of all swims on the lake, the wood swim. Many fish are lost in the pads week after week. Not good for the anglers because obviously nobody wants to come down here and then lose big fish, and it's really not good for the fish. The fish are often left with gear, rigs etc. in their mouths, trailing around line. Even worse, it can get tethered up, or at best they're ripping themselves off the rigs, but then this is, you know, creating mouth damage, which nobody wants. It's not really necessary to lose fish. There's some simple things you can do to prevent the risk or reduce the risk to almost zero. I've been fishing this swim for the last 24 hours. I've had 5 takes, hooked 5 fish, landed all 5 fish, up to 54 pounds, so big powerful fish. None of the fish have made it into the pads at all, and it's just by following a few simple rules of thumb that I've used in my own fishing now for decades basically. It all starts from where you position the rig. It's very tempting when you see fish in the pads to position the rig very close to the pads. We see people go out in a bait boat, nudge the edge of the leaves of the pads with the front of the bait boat and then drop the rig there. Some people will actually drive the boat right in. For example here, if I zoom in, you can see there's a channel in the pads here going between 2 sets. Now the fish will show in there all the time, and it's tempting, I know, to put the drive a bait boat or just cast right into the middle of that channel. Almost every single fish, if not 100% of the fish you hook in the middle of there, will be lost. And if you also fish with the rig pretty well touching the leaves as it goes into the water, every fish you hook will at least be in the pads to start with. You might get some out, but you're going to lose a lot of fish as well. It's just not necessary. The first thing to do is think about the position of the rig relative to the pads. Now this swim is quite safe or quite easy because you're only fishing at about 40 yards range first of all, and the edge of the pads are roughly 90 degrees to the direction you're fishing to them from, so they're kind of parallel to the swim and the bank we're fishing from here. It's a different situation if you're fishing down a set of pads where the line runs parallel to the pads and you're fishing along the edges of them, like for example the wood swim on this lake. Then the distance away from the pads you need to be is much further, and we'll do a separate video about that in the future at some point. But when you're fishing in a swim like this up to a set of pads at about 90 degrees, simple rule of thumb is the minimum distance that the rig should be positioned from the pads is about 10% of the distance between the swim and the pads. So in this case the pads are at 40 yards, 10% of 40 yards is 4 yards. The closest I would position a rig to the pads in this swim is 4 yards. If you're fishing at 100 yards to the edge of a set of pads, then the closest I would position the rig is 10 yards. At 50 yards the closest would be 5 yards, and so on. The reason for having this distance is there's a certain degree of stretch in nearly all lines, monofilaments and fluorocarbons, somewhere between 5 and 10%. It's a lot more than people realise. So even if you don't give the fish an inch of line when you hook it, it's able to take up to 5 to 10% of the distance between you and the fish, just based on line stretch. So here the fish could swim probably nearly 4 yards backwards away from the swim, just based on the stretch. Secondly, you've got a certain lift on the indicator that you have to get some bite indication. This allows the fish an extra foot or something of distance. And then you've also got a certain degree of slack in the line to start with, which can be taken up by the fish without you giving any line. So first of all, fish a safe distance off the pads, and don't be tempted through the week to get closer and closer. We see this happen all the time. If you don't put any bait at all in the pads or even against the edge of the pads, bait up off the pads where you're actually fishing, the fish will basically come out to the bait. If it's a good bait that they want, they will always come out to it. It might take a couple of days. It's better to get a few less takes and land 100% than loads of takes and lose 90%, which we see week after week, to be honest. The next thing that's really important is the rod setup itself. Now, I talk to people often about fishing locked up, and it seems a lot of people don't really understand what locked up means. When I say locked up fishing, the clutch should be set tight, screwed all the way down, and if you have a bait runner on the reel you're using, then the bait runner should be off, not on. The idea is not to give the fish any line whatsoever. Now, it seems a bit scary when you first do that, especially with the size of fish that you're fishing for in France. But it's all about momentum. If the fish picks up the rig and spooks, it's hooked itself, it tries to swim directly away from you. If you don't give it any line at all, it does not have the chance to build up any momentum. Now, if you give it a few feet and you think, okay, I'm just going to lessen the risk of a hook pull by giving it a few feet, as soon as you allow it a few feet, it gains momentum, and it's really, really difficult to stop. And in fact, the risk of a hook pull or line snapping or something is higher if you give it a little bit of line than not giving it any line, because you're not allowing any momentum if you don't give it line. What happens is the fish tries to swim towards the pads, because the tension builds up in the line as it moves away from you. The head of the fish gets pulled round, left, right, sometimes upwards, and you'll either get a big boil on the surface or you'll get a big bow wave heading left or right from the spot you hooked it. The fish kind of goes in an arc, and as long as you've got a safe distance off the pads to start with, the arc of the travel of the fish won't allow it to reach the pads. To do this safely, you need to be using rods set up in a way where you have some butt rests which hold or grip the rods tightly. Here I'm using the Solar ones, but you can have any type that grips the butt tightly. You want to have the rods set up, as you can see here, slightly upwards, pointing slightly upwards. The reason for this is two things. First of all, when the rod's pointing upwards, it gets pulled. The tighter the line and the more the fish pulls, the rod gets pulled down into the buzzer. I have seen people fish with their rods pointing downwards, and in this case it's possible for the rod to get pulled up and out of the buzzer. You could even lose the rod this way. So slightly upwards helps to hold the rod in place on the buzzer. You don't need snag ears and those sort of things if you do that. Secondly, the rod should be pointed directly at the spot. If you're fishing at an angle, if the line has an angle between the tip of the rod and the spot, it can get pulled sideways off the buzzer. The rod can again be lost. The other thing about having the rods pointing upwards is when you do get a take, you can look at the rod tip, you'll get a few bleeps, the indicator pulls up tight, the line goes very tight, and the rod tip starts pulling downwards. And this is a kind of additional check to make sure that you're going to hit what's a proper take and not just a line bite. If you get a proper take, it'll be really obvious. The rod starts bending severely downwards and shaking. If you don't have this angle with the rod pointing upwards, you'll find if you point the rod directly at the spot, for example, the line just gets tighter and tighter, and there's very little indication at that point that anything's happening, especially at night. The next thing is you do need a drop on the indicators. If you don't have a drop on the indicators, we see frequently people fishing very tight lines and small indicators, light indicators right at the top, and the bait runner done up tight or the clutch done up tight. You don't really get any bleeps because if you don't have a drop on the indicator, the line can't move outwards, and therefore the roller of the buzzer, if it is a roller type buzzer, can't indicate any bleeps. If you're using Delkims, they can work from vibration. You might get 1 or 2 bleeps, but that's about it. So I recommend, if you set up, as you can see here, with a small drop on the indicator, and the bite alarm should be set to its most sensitive level. So you'll get a quick flurry of bleeps as the indicator goes up. The indicator will reach the rod top, or it'll reach all the way to the top of its travel. The bleeps will stop, and then the rod tip will start going down, and that's the time to hit it. The other thing is, if you have line clips on your rods, as you can see here, put the line in the line clip, it creates a better, steeper angle between the rod, the buzzer and the indicator, and this will get you an extra few bleeps and also a little bit of extra sensitivity. You'll get bleeps a fraction of a second earlier than you would have done. Also, when the line pulls out of the clip, you sometimes hear the line ping out of the clip, which is great, and a few more bleeps can result just from that little bit of slack being taken up between the clip and the reel. It's all a question of getting a few bleeps but not giving the fish too much line. Now, as I'm only fishing here at about 40 yards range or less than where the rig's placed, I'm only using a light indicator. The line is as tight as I can get it with this light indicator, which is still kind of semi-slack at this range, and that's an incredibly sensitive setup. Even a fraction of a foot or so movement of the rig will create an immediate reaction at the indicator end. As you fish further and further out, to have this drop on the indicator, you need a heavier and heavier indicator. I use these little matrix indicators, and I just add extra weights until in the end I can have even 3 or 4 weights on it. Now, if you're fishing at, let's say, 150 yards or something like that range, long distance to pads, you've got a lot of undertow on the line, and a lot of, even with hardly any wind, there's movement of the water all the time. The line keeps tightening up, and a light indicator, as I'm using in this swim, would be completely useless. It'll end up at the rod butt all the time. You let out a bit more line to get a drop on it and it creeps up all the time. So you have to have a heavier indicator the further out you fish. You must have a small amount of drop, and try to have the line as tight as possible without initially stretching it. Once the line's in a stretched state, the fish can hook itself, spook, run away from you and just further stretch the line without giving you much indication. The line is more sensitive before it's in its stretched state, and the indication system is more sensitive. Next thing is, if you're fishing to a snag of pads or anything like that, a really important thing is do not use any back leads. If you use a back lead, you've got a steep angle between the line leaving the rod tip, going down to the back lead and then out to the rig. When the fish takes the rig and gets hooked, first of all, the back lead reduces sensitivity. The fish can move sometimes long distances. It can kite in particular left or right without you getting any indication at all. Then when the indicator goes up on the rod to the rod butt, and you get a few bleeps. After that, you're left with the back lead lifting out off the bottom and the line tightening. All this allows the fish to move quite a considerable distance further away from you, and therefore get into the pads potentially. So no back leads definitely when fishing snags or pads is highly recommended. Then another issue is the gear itself. You really need to be using line which is of adequate strength. The pads in Lac Souillère are really severe. The root systems are thicker than your arm in some cases. Also, it's quite abrasive, some of the areas and features that the line will pass over if the fish does enter one of these snaggy or pad areas. So here I'm using 20-pound line, which is 0.43 millimeters in diameter. And to be honest, I wouldn't use less in this situation. There's no need, especially at this range. No leaders or anything like that. You're going to have the line all the way through directly to the leg clip. I'm then using 25-pound hook length material and a size 6 wide gape barbless hook. Don't worry about the barbless hooks. I know a lot of people do. If the fish doesn't reach the pads and you keep the line tight, there is absolutely no difference between a barbed or a barbless hook. The barb doesn't come into effect unless the line goes slack. If the fish does enter the pads, and once this happens the line can go slack, then yeah, there's quite a high chance the fish will come off, and that's the whole reason we have the barbless rule on Lac Souillère. We want fish that when they reach the pads and get snagged up, we want them to come off because it's safer, especially if the main line's broken, which happens every single week, almost every single week. If the fish enters the pads, then something went wrong in the first place. There's no reason why the fish should enter the pads if you fish in the way I've described in this little video. So barbless hooks are not a disadvantage despite what a lot of people think. if you fish in a safe way in the first place, then you won't lose any additional fish. So in summary, first of all, the position of the rig is really important. You should be fishing at least 10% of the distance out you are between the swim and the pads off the pads. So at 40 yards, at least 4 yards off the pads. Make sure there's a small drop on the indicators so you get some bleeps. Add more and more weight to the indicators as you fish further and further out. Fish truly locked up with the bait runner tight or off and the clutch tight. Don't give the fish any line whatsoever when you hook it. Don't allow it to gain momentum away from you, because it will get into the pads if you do. Don't fish with back leads, and fish with adequate strong gear. That means line and hooks. The line should be new or relatively new, not old line. And be confident how you handle the fish. When you hook a fish in this situation, somebody once said to me, the first 4 seconds determines whether you're going to land the fish or not, and I think that's right. One last tip: when you do hook the fish, you have to gain control really quickly the first few seconds. One definite thing to do that's an advantage is take 2 or 3 steps backwards. So lean into the fish. Everything will be really tight. The fish will be boiling probably on the surface or near to the surface. Take 2 or 3 steps backwards, and this also takes compensates for the stretch in the line and keeps the fish just off the pads. Usually, if you follow these kind of guidelines, you'll find the fish boils within 2-3 feet of the pads, the edge of the pads each time. If you take those 2 or 3 steps backwards, then within 5 seconds you're in control of the fish, and it's clear of the pads and swimming sideways, left or right, or even sometimes towards you if you're lucky. So I hope this is of some help, and we'll be doing an additional video in the future at some point about fishing the wood swim, which is a different set of conditions.